Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second of the University of Lincoln's series of talks on climate change. I'm Professor Libby John. I'm chair of the Environment and Sustainability Committee here at the University of Lincoln, and I'm really pleased to welcome today Rebecca Forster, who's our Sustainability Manager here at the University of Lincoln and works in our estates team. She's been here at the University of Lincoln since 2017. She's a chartered environmentalist, and she was one of the people who helped to set up, with others, the Lincoln Climate Commission, which was a really great venture for the city. She's passionate about positive engagement on sustainability and climate action. And she's going to talk to us today about being carbon conscious and measuring your environmental footprint. So I'm sure you will enjoy this talk. Please do ask questions. We've got a way for you to ask questions, and we'll pick up all the questions at the end of Rebecca's talk. So enjoy the talk. Over to Rebecca.
Thanks, Libby, and hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Rebecca, and I'm going to be giving you a brief, practical overview of carbon footprinting. So last week, Edward Hanna set the scene on the known science behind global warming and the importance of keeping this to 1.5 degrees C. To put this importance into context, global temperatures during the last ice age were only 5 to 6 degrees cooler than they are today. So this shows that small changes in average global temperatures have a big impact on our ability to live our lives in the way that we're used to. But all certainly not lost, and we can all play a part in collectively managing our impact on the environment. As a disclaimer, I'm not professing to be perfect in this area, and I'm not going to be preaching to you about having to live a net zero lifestyle now. I'm aiming to help you identify where your biggest areas of impact are and hopefully inspire you to make at least one change to reduce your own personal carbon footprint. First, let's start with some definitions of the terms I'm going to be using. So first of all, carbon. Often when we say carbon, it's an abbreviation for all of the global warming greenhouse gases. So it's otherwise known as CO2 equivalent or carbon equivalent. Carbon footprint is the amount of carbon equivalent released into the atmosphere as a result of the activities of a particular individual, organisation or community. Embodied carbon, I mean all carbon equivalent emitted in producing materials. So that's estimated from the energy used to extract and transport raw materials and emissions from manufacturing processes. So you could talk about the embodied carbon of a building, and that would include the energy required to create the concrete, for example. Next is direct emissions, so emissions that a person or organisation has direct control of. So that could be energy consumed, fuel burned on site, and they're also known as Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Finally, indirect emissions are those that are influenced by a person or organisation, but there is less direct control over them. So you could talk about emissions from waste disposal when you don't know how your local authority is disposing of that or treating that waste, or business travel for your own carbon footprint, for example. So indirect emissions are also known as Scope 3 emissions. When people talk about carbon emissions, as I just said, they're usually referring to more broadly to greenhouse gas emissions, of which there are 6 key types. So the first is carbon dioxide, or CO2, and that's the major contributor to climate change. However, there are 5 others that contribute to climate change too. The second being methane. There's also nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride, more commonly known as SF6. Each gas has a different global warming potential, with some being far more potent than others. So for example, the final one, SF6, has a global warming potential of over 23,000 times more than carbon dioxide. It's got a bouncy insulating consistency, so it's often used in things like switchgear for electrical substations. But funnily enough, it also was until recently used in the bubble in Nike Air soles, hence the picture on this slide. because of that bounciness. So luckily that's now been removed by Nike, because it was fine when it was kept in there, but as soon as it was crushed, it was released to atmosphere and had a negative environmental impact. The basic principles of carbon footprint are essentially A times B equals C. So there are two key components, A being the quantity of activity you're measuring. So for example, the number of miles you're traveling in a car, and B is the carbon conversion factor. So this is calculated by DEFRA in the UK every year. And we're still on the 2020 data set at the moment, which you can download if you search for it. It comes in the form of an Excel spreadsheet, and it gives the carbon conversion factor for hundreds of different criteria and activities. So we use the published factors each year. When you have the A and B values, you simply multiply them together, and that's the output of a carbon equivalent, so associated with any given activity. So it sounds really simple, but often the most difficult element is tracking down accurate data for that A part. I'll talk a bit more about that now. So this is a basic example of carbon footprinting a flight to New York. So flying economy class, it's 5,540 kilometers. And this is an extract from the carbon conversion factor spreadsheet, which gives a carbon conversion factor of 0.14615 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilometer per passenger. And notice the difference between first class and economy class. So first class has an impact of 0.58, so roughly 4 times the carbon impact of traveling economy class due to the space being taken up on the plane. So in total, for a return flight, you get 1.6 tons of carbon equivalent per passenger. And that would be, the carbon footprint of that particular flight. It's all well and good saying 1.6 tons of carbon, but what does that mean in context? And I think this is part of the problem with carbon accounting and reduction. No one can visualize it. Carbon is invisible, it's intangible. This picture on the right was from COP15, and it was a sculpture that was erected in Copenhagen to show the volume of 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's roughly the size of one medium-sized bungalow or a hot air balloon. And what's the purpose of carbon footprinting? Why bother with it? So the theory is that you have to be able to measure something to inform a reduction. It is possible to calculate the carbon impact of almost anything if you have the right data. However, it isn't always practical or efficient to do so. You can, however, use carbon footprint data to inform specific choices and to determine whether the lifestyle that you lead is low impact, medium impact, or high impact. And you can also use carbon footprinting to identify where your carbon hotspots are, and it might help you to focus on where to reduce your carbon impact. Easier than manually calculating the impact of everything you do or individual activities, you can use more user-friendly online tools. So the one I find to be best is the WWF Environmental Footprint Calculator. It's simple to use, it's an online questionnaire, and it presents your emissions data in a really clear way to identify the highest areas of impact. So I'll show you an extract from mine. This is an example of the output I had when I used the footprint calculator in March 2020. So it was actually when we were due to originally present this lecture series. As you can see, travel is by far my largest area of impact. Within that year previous, I'd taken 3 return flights to Europe, and I commuted from Nottingham to Lincoln via car and train 5 days a week. So it was by far my biggest level of carbon impact. So if I was looking, or as I did, got a bit shocked by that breakdown and looked to reduce travel emissions. Obviously, COVID has taken that out of my hands, and I'll show you later what my carbon footprint is now. Looking at some of the other elements, so food, I am vegetarian, so that would mean my impact in the area of food is lower than most, or if I was a meat eater, but it's still significant. The area of stuff is largely to do with the purchase of goods, so clothes and other things. And then home is mostly to do with heating and energy used within the home. So I had a total carbon footprint of 13.1 tons. But again, how does that compare? Oh, here we go. So it's one thing saying that I've got an annual carbon footprint of 13 tonnes a year, but what can you do with that information? What's good or what's bad? So there is little robust data on average carbon footprints, but the 10-tonne lifestyle has been cited often as a more sustainable one for individuals in the UK to aim for in the short and medium term. It should be a lot less in the long term. However, if everyone in the world had a 10-tonne carbon footprint, global carbon emissions would increase by 40%. So it's clearly not enough to aim for 10, and there's clearly more that we can do to push our individual footprint down. This graph visualizes the global disparity between carbon emissions per capita. So as you can see, they predominantly come from North America, Northern Europe, Australasia, and the Middle East. I won't dwell on that for too long, but it gives you a picture of the disparity. And it's clearly a global problem which needs to be tackled by governments and corporations, and it's often difficult to see how us as individuals can help tackle such a huge and complex problem. However, we all have a part to play in supporting climate action, and collectively we can make a difference. So it's better to make one change to reduce your carbon footprint than to think the challenge is too big to do anything or to make a difference. So feel too intimidated to start. And what does drive people to choose more environmentally friendly action? So this could be the topic of an entire session. So climate psychology is really interesting, and I know there's research taking place within the University of Lincoln on the subject. It's common for people to have a naturally defensive reaction to the topic of climate change, particularly when it's communicated in a doom and gloom or negative way. And it naturally invokes feelings of despair or helplessness in the face of such a large challenge. Another common reaction to this is to be agnostic. So to put it out of your mind, think that other people can deal with the problem and there's nothing we can do about it anyway. To fight this natural reaction, it's really important to communicate climate change and action in positive, hopeful ways, highlighting the benefit of behaviour change and tailoring that depending on who it is that you're talking to. So different people, I think, have different hooks into sustainability, and it's useful to be conscious of these and to tap into them. So consider what motivates you to protect the environment or to be more sustainable. What do you care about? It may be spending time outdoors, it might be gardening, saving energy, saving money. It could be that you're interested in innovation or social equality. If you're looking for motivation to make a change, focus initially on the area closest to that area of interest or passion. And studies show that you're more likely to stick with the change if it relates to something that you're interested in or passionate about. And if you're successful in that change, it's therefore more likely to lead to other more sustainable behaviours. So for the next section of the presentation, I'll focus on what are, on average, the most significant elements of a carbon footprint in no particular order. Firstly, energy consumed in our homes produces direct emissions that are often within our control, particularly if you own your home. So the UK government has set a national target to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And this largely depends on the ability to decarbonise heat, or domestic heat particularly. They've said that no new boilers will be installed in new homes by or from 2025, and all gas boilers are going to be phased out from all homes by 2035. So they'll start to be replaced with hydrogen and electric powered alternatives that will have a lower carbon impact by then as the national grid decarbonises. There are currently grants to help with home insulation and efficiency measures. However, if you don't own your own home, there are still simple actions you can take that will make a difference and save energy. So this is a really simple example of a carbon footprint of a daily activity and how little actions can change the amount of carbon that you're responsible for. So walking through a door on a summer's day is likely to have zero carbon impact. However, the bigger the door and the colder it is outside, that impact will increase. So this shows the impact of losing heat and the energy required to reheat that space. Fresh air obviously has benefits, particularly now, but you shouldn't, under normal circumstances, be heating air that's immediately being expelled outside in winter. So, for example, when the heating's on, a window shouldn't be open in terms of energy use. So you could do things like blocking gaps, preventing drafts from under doors, for example, and this will reduce the heating demand and save carbon. So that's a difference potentially between walking through a door of 0 carbon or 84 grams. So this is something we're looking at the university when you think of large atriums and large electric doors. This example is less applicable to the home, but I've included it because I'm often asked by staff at the university about whether paper towels or a hand dryer is more sustainable. So, as is often the case with these kind of questions, the answer is usually it depends. In this case, it depends on how efficient the hand dryer is and how many paper towels are being used. So at home, obviously drying your hands with a towel is the lowest carbon choice. At work, if you're in an office usually, using an efficient dryer or one paper towel would be preferable. It is surprising though, I think, how small actions with a relatively low carbon impact can add up over the course of a year when you're doing it so frequently. So this suggests that using public toilets 6 times a day, the energy used from drying your hands can equate to up to 15 kilograms per year, or the equivalent of eating a kilogram of beef. There are undoubtedly environmental benefits to online working and communication, but the carbon impact of data is often ignored. So globally, emissions from data and internet use exceeds those from aviation. While simple emails have a low impact, that impact can increase. So for example, if the email has large attachments or it's sent to multiple recipients who all receive that attachment, the energy required to download data and these documents does add up. So, for example, you could do things like inserting a link to a document so that only the people who need to download the attachment can do so. Whilst many of us are working from home at the moment, we're shifting some emissions that were previously associated with the workplace to our homes and our personal footprints. So some tips to reduce energy use while home working could be things like reducing excessive emails, as we've just talked about, changing to messaging apps such as Microsoft Teams and WhatsApp for frequent email conversations. They're often more energy efficient than email. You could change your search engine to an eco-friendly provider. So an example could be Ecosia, which has some biodiversity benefits as they plant trees depending on the number of searches they receive. It's advisable to shut down computers when away from them for more than 2 hours to save energy, and unplug equipment that's not in use, especially overnight. As you saw from my carbon footprint, travel is often the most significant element of your impact, so particularly flights. So in fact, one flight can be the carbon equivalent of using a small car in a year, depending on a number of factors. COVID has obviously prompted both an appreciation of freedom to travel, but also it gives us a chance to reflect on it. So perhaps some people, and me included, will instead be considering more domestic travel, or to focus on one longer holiday abroad each year rather than a series of shorter trips. So city breaks are arguably the least efficient kind of international travel when you have the emissions associated with the flight, but a short amount of time at the destination. So it could be worth considering your travel patterns and where you might be able to reduce that impact. On to food, a topic close to many of our hearts. The environmental benefits of a vegan diet are often talked about, so I'm not going to go into it too much here, as I know it's not practical for everyone, but there are some simple tips that you could try to consider to reduce the impact of the food that you consume. So ideas could be to reduce meat and dairy consumption as much as you can, reduce food waste, which is a huge one. So in my eyes, it's kind of they're lost, pointless emissions, which are the most wasteful when food is left to rot and thrown away. It would be good to buy seasonally and better locally. So a useful starting point is to get a seasonal fruit and vegetable calendar for the UK, which is the image on the right, and to think of meals that align with what's in season each month, because sometimes it's hard to food is something that sits in the supermarket and not necessarily something that we're aware of growing not too far away, particularly in Lincolnshire. So just building that closer connection to food and seasonality has environmental impacts. There are also calculators online that show you what the carbon impact of different foods have, different from the WWF calculator. But if you're interested in the carbon impact of food, I can point you to some useful resources. Here's a simple example of carbon footprinting a banana, and it's actually taken, as a lot of this data is, from the book How Bad Are Bananas by Mike Berners-Lee, which is a good read. Each banana has around 80 grams of embodied carbon, so it isn't actually that bad when you consider the energy and nutrition per gram. I think things like bananas, because they're not grown in this country, have a bad reputation, and I realise I've just said eat seasonally and locally, but of all things, bananas shouldn't be shamed. So they're only bad when they're not eaten and left to rot in the food bowl. So the largest impact of food in general is the amount of food that's thrown away. So think about the energy, the food miles, the water that is inputted to the growing cycle. So all of this is wasted if the calorific energy or value isn't realised by an end consumer. So only buy what you need, plan your meals, make a list when you go to the supermarket, and try and cut down on the amount of food that's thrown away. Another example close to our hearts is that of beer. So this example highlights the difference between locally brewed beer on tap, which has a much lower carbon footprint, than imported beer, which is stored and transported in glass bottles. So something to consider when the pubs reopen, but essentially you can have, for the same carbon impact, you can have 3 pints of local ale in a pub than 1 bottled beer that's been transported from Europe, say. So the final example in this section is the carbon impact of tea and coffee. Again, something we know that isn't grown in this country, so it's always imported. But similarly with the previous examples, the choices you make can reduce the overall impact, so particularly when considered over the course of a year. For each cup of tea or coffee with cold milk, and this is the important bit, when only boiling the water that you need, it looks to be 53 grams of carbon for 1 cup. However, on average, double the amount of water is boiled in a kettle by people. They fill it up to the top even when they want only 1 cup. And that increases the carbon impact from 53 to 73. So only boil the amount of water that you need. So to put it into context of per day, if you, like me, have 4 cups of tea a day, that equates to 1.5 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per week. So it does add up. Like with food, the carbon impact of purchased goods are usually hidden, but they can often be significant, especially when something's only used once or twice. So like the way you can decide whether you purchase something based on cost per wear, you can take the same approach to and apply it to carbon. So to put things into context, a pair of jeans has a carbon footprint of roughly 5 to 8 kilograms of carbon. But if they're an item that is worn again and again, reused, and only thrown away or recycled when they're no longer fit for purpose, that isn't that bad. So it's goods with a short lifespan that are more in need of being addressed, and potentially things that you could consider. So a rose is a good example of a high carbon product with a short lifespan, and is obviously quite seasonal at the moment to talk about. There aren't many roses in bloom in the UK during February, so they're imported from countries like India and Ethiopia in their millions for Valentine's Day each year. A single red rose has a carbon footprint of 2.1 kilograms of CO2 equivalent due to growing processes, irrigation, fertilizers, transportation, and the cooling required to keep them looking perfect. In 2017 alone, 8 million roses were transported into the UK through Heathrow Airport. Wrapped in plastic, transported in refrigerated vehicles, sold, kept for a week, potentially by the end consumer, and then thrown away. So those 8 million roses equate to over 16,000 tonnes of carbon. That's the equivalent of 1,680 people's sustainable 10-tonne lifestyle. So as with food, look to see where your flowers are produced. You could stick to seasonal varieties. Imagine if we started giving daffodils for Valentine's Day, or wildflowers even. When buying products, it's good to be aware of your supply chain. Things don't simply appear in shops, then disappear when thrown away. So their lifetime value should be considered. Things like buying less. Do you need to buy something? Choosing products with less packaging. Being aware of your supply chain, and buying locally produced goods whenever possible. I think one of the main problems is that carbon impact of purchased goods is rarely transparent. Some brands have started labelling the carbon footprint of a product. So this is an example of a carton of oat milk, which you can see is labelled as 0.31 kilograms of CO2e per kilogram of oat milk. Corn is another example of a brand that is introducing this labelling, although is it effective if the only brands the only brands doing it are the more sustainable ones that want to kind of shout about the good work that they're doing? Does it then become more of a marketing ploy than a method of informing consumer choices? There is a strong argument to make carbon labelling mandatory for all. So in my opinion, it would be really good for the end consumer to be able to make informed choices. Tesco did make a pledge to put carbon labels on all of its products in 2007, but it actually backtracked from doing that because in 2012, because they said it was too difficult a message for their customers to understand. So how do we create more conscious consumers who can read a carbon label? Imagine if there was widespread uptake across all supermarkets of like traffic light style systems of carbon impact. How would you feel about that? So it's all about raising awareness of what's good, what's bad, and what's worth it in terms of nutritional value and what you like to buy. In order to inform carbon reduction, you could set a goal to learn more about it. These are examples of some books that I'd recommend. They're quite widespread. If anyone has any books or resources that you found useful, how about popping it into the chat to share with others? I've used, as I said earlier, a lot of the data from How Bad Are Bananas by Mike Berners-Lee, and that is an interesting read that I'd recommend. The Carbon Literacy Project runs courses on this topic, and we may be able to facilitate carbon literacy training at the university for staff and students. So if there's interest in it, then feel free to get in touch. There's also this lecture series, which I encourage you to subscribe to, and also the Science Museum is running a series of climate talks at the moment. Oh, there we go. So other ways in which you can make a difference are via conversations with others. So as a friend or family member or customer or voter or as a constituent, people are more likely to be influenced by their peers or someone they respect. So it's always worth sharing some of the changes that you're thinking about making, and it might encourage others to do the same. So similarly, if you decide to stop using a brand or a shop because you prefer a more sustainable alternative, it's always worth feeding back to them on the reasons why you decided to do that. So you'd be surprised by how much organisations listen to feedback from customers or the people they work for. You could also have these conversations with your local MP and lobby if you feel passionate about a particular topic. A brief word on carbon offsetting. Again, this is something that could be talked about all day, but just kind of a word of warning against offsetting being used to justify carbon intensive activities. The first step should always be to reduce carbon, and then remaining emissions could be offset by a viable scheme. when organisations talk about being net zero carbon, this is usually what they're doing or what they should be doing, reducing first and then offsetting any remaining emissions. And I'd always be a bit suspicious of any brands or organisations that were going to be instantly net zero carbon, because you always want them to spend the time reducing first. So I said I'd show you an updated carbon footprint. So this is a bit about how COVID is impacting our carbon emissions. So on the left is the carbon footprint from March 2020, and the right one is one that I did last week. As you can see, COVID has impacted and reduced my footprint, certainly in the area of travel. So it's gone down overall from 13.1 tonnes to 9.6. And a temporary reduction in carbon emissions has been reported on a global scale during the last year. However, it is predicted to bounce back up if economic recovery is based on spending and economic growth. There is a lot of really interesting talk and articles about what a green recovery would look like and the environmental benefits of building back in a more environmentally friendly way. So you can see, just to break down my comparison, my travel emissions have gone right down, unsurprisingly. My home emissions have gone up, and that's mainly to do with the amount of energy that I'm using while spending more time at home. Stuff I think is a bit skewed because I bought like a tablet and a computer during the last year, so they have a big impact. And food is broadly stayed the same in terms of actual tonnage of emissions. So it might be interesting if you're thinking about using the WWF calculator to do a before and after COVID and to see how changes that you've made over the last year, perhaps beyond your control, have impacted what your environmental impact looks like. So in summary, carbon footprint is useful for, it's really useful for weighing up different options, informing decisions and identifying your biggest area of impact. So footprinting everything isn't going to be feasible. You would be here all day and tie yourself in knots with spreadsheets and carbon conversion factors. But for specific activities, it may be relevant to use the carbon conversion factor and calculate to give yourself different options, informed options. But things like the environmental calculator is a much more user-friendly option to look at your overall impact. So there is obviously more to environmental impact than just carbon. There's ecological impact, there's water consumption, there's issues like plastic pollution and land degradation, but carbon is generally used as a proxy for your impact on climate change. So remember, your actions and behaviours do have an impact on climate change. It's your choice as to how big an impact that is. And collectively, if we all make small changes, that will add up and make a big change on a global scale. So that's all from me. Thanks for listening, and I'll pass back to Libby, and hopefully we'll be able to take some of your questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was brilliant. Really clear, and lots of useful tips there for people to think about and take away. And I'll certainly be picking up on some of those reading ideas. We do have some questions and thoughts from people listening. So Edward Hanna, who talked last week, has asked, he said, good point on food and seasonality, but how do we reconcile this with supporting developing world producers? Do you have any thoughts on that one? Tricky one.
That is a difficult question from Edward. Yeah, it is difficult. And I think often some of the challenges when people ask questions about what's more sustainable, the answer is often it depends on a number of factors, and it depends what you're prioritizing in terms of environmental and social impact. I think from a carbon point of view, it's undoubtedly less carbon intensive to choose locally produced food. There are obviously products that we need to import, so things like the coffee, the tea, and I think being an ethical consumer in those areas for the products that we need to buy from overseas, and looking for things like fair trade certification, and being conscious of your supply chain. So, I recognise that some of those options are sometimes more expensive, but just doing a bit of research in terms of what is the most responsible choice when you do have to buy products that come from the other side of the world.
Thanks, Rebecca. And then Edward's asked another question, which is a really important one too. Many of the products we buy these days have built-in obsolescence. They don't last long, and it's economically unviable to repair many when they break. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is definitely, I agree. So things like phones are a really good example, and often phones are designed to be replaced every 3 years, and they are on average. But because they're built, they're non-modular. When the battery goes, sometimes you can replace the battery, but when anything else goes, you can't get into it to break it down and replace just that element. You have to buy something completely new. And I think some brands are getting quite a bit of stick about that at the moment. And there are other companies that are bringing taking the phone example, you can get modular phones now that you can take every single piece out and replace just what's broken and build it back up again. Obviously, they're not mainstream yet, but there's really interesting work in the area of the circular economy, and things like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that look at truly promoting the circular economy and circular design, building things to last for longer than just that short period of time and then being thrown away. Again, it's a topic that could be talked about all day, but yeah, there is some interesting work in that area.
And I guess we all have a responsibility when we're buying an item to ask those questions and to choose from brands that focus on repairability. I mean, it's not always an option for everything we need to buy, but it is something we can think about more. Just because something's cheap doesn't mean it's good value necessarily. We have an interesting question from Bob Mortimer, who says your journey from Nottingham to Lincoln needs to be free on high quality publicly owned kit. This needs public policy changes, not just your efforts. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's where, Bob, our vote comes in, isn't it? Is helping to select those right choices, helping our politicians to make those right choices. Have you got any thoughts on that, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think everywhere there's always challenges to choosing more sustainable options. And for me, yeah, taking the train, I did it, but it takes longer than just getting in a car and driving. So it's just about weighing up and appreciating that there are sometimes barriers to choosing the sustainable options, and not necessarily to beat yourself about it all the time, but just to do what you can. I think in terms of the policy change, definitely. And I think that would be something that perhaps you could share with your local MP or the council, or to feed back to things like rail companies. If you don't think there's enough services on that line, and get a critical mass. The more people to feed back, the more likely it is for something to change.
Yes, absolutely. There aren't a lot of other questions, Rebecca. I guess I'm going to ask, if someone like me, incredibly busy, as we all are, had time to just read one of those books you put on the reading list, which one would it be?
I think, well, I've mentioned it a couple of times, so I feel like I'm being sponsored by him. But The How Bad Are the Bananas is a really good introduction to carbon footprinting. And I think if you just want an idea of comparing different activities, you'll be surprised by how different activities compare in terms of carbon and environmental impact. So I'd probably encourage you to go with that one. I think the one I flashed up by David Attenborough is obviously probably more a softer introduction to environmental issues, and hopefully will get you inspired to make some changes. So yeah, I'd say those two.
I'm going to go for the bananas one personally. Okay. Absolutely. So we have another comment from Bob. Yes, it is up to politicians, and I guess yes, in the city of Lincoln, we might have politicians who have a different thoughts about this. It is a choice that society makes, how to support public transport. Absolutely. Yeah, well, there aren't any more questions coming up, Rebecca. So I'm going to thank you once again, unless any pop up in the next few minutes. But thank you so much. I thought that was brilliant. It'll really help me to focus on things I can do slightly differently. And I'm going to go on that World Wildlife Fund calculator this evening and work out what my own personal footprint is, and see where I can squeeze down just that little bit more, because that's what we've all got to do, isn't it? A little bit less, and that will get us in the right direction. Yeah, so thank you, Rebecca. I thought that was brilliant. Absolutely stunning. So our next lecture is this time next week, starting at 11 a.m. on the 24th of February. Someone else agrees that it was a very interesting lecture. So our next, let me just get the title up. The next one is Professor Mark Macklin, and he'll be talking about rivers, flooding and floodplains. So I think that's going to be another really interesting and exciting lecture on a completely different topic from today's, but it's all linked together in this issue of climate change. Which is probably one of it. I do agree with Bill Gates. This is the biggest challenge humanity's faced collectively to date. So the more we can learn and talk about it in sessions like these, the better. So thank you, everyone who's watched today. We really appreciate you being here and listening in. And do get in touch if you've got any questions. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you, and thanks again, Rebecca. I'm sure we'd all be clapping if it was in a lecture theatre.
Thank you.